There's nothing quite like watching your childhood home being sold piece by piece to strangers. 4 sisters stood helpless as their father's belongings were auctioned off, knowing they'd soon lose the land that held every precious memory of their family. The bidders came like vultures, ready to pick clean what remained of their lives. Clayton Rourke was the richest man in 3 counties, known for buying out struggling families without a second thought. Everyone expected him to take their homestead and leave them with nothing. But when he stepped forward with his winning bid, something unexpected happened. He handed the deed straight to the eldest sister and walked away. What could drive a ruthless businessman to such an act of kindness? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Carver homestead, painting the weathered wood of the porch in golden hues that reminded Grace of better times. She sat in her father's old rocking chair, watching dust motes dance in the light streaming through the kitchen window, and tried to make sense of what had happened just 12 hours ago. The family Bible lay open in her lap, its leather binding cracked from years of use and love. Between the pages of Psalms, pressed wildflowers from her mother's garden still held traces of their original purple. Violets that had bloomed the spring before consumption took Sarah Carver away, leaving Tom to raise 4 daughters on a sheriff's modest pay. Grace traced the delicate petals with her fingertip, remembering how her mother used to say that flowers pressed in God's word would carry his blessings forever. "Grace." Hope's voice drifted from the kitchen, accompanied by the familiar sounds of breakfast preparation. The coffee's ready, and Faith's already gathering eggs. At 28, Grace had been shouldering the weight of family responsibility since their mother's death 8 years ago. She'd watched her father age beyond his years, seen the worry lines deepen around his eyes as debts mounted and his health declined. Sheriff Tom Carver had been a good man, honest, fair, and beloved by the town of Bitter Creek, but goodness didn't pay medical bills or keep food on the table for a growing family. The homestead had been in the Carver family for 2 generations. Grace's grandfather had claimed this patch of Montana territory back in 1867, building the original cabin with his own hands and clearing the rocky soil for farming. Her father had expanded it over the years, adding rooms as each daughter arrived, dreaming of the day he'd see them all settled and happy on this land that held their family's heart. Now those dreams lay scattered like autumn leaves in yesterday's auction dust. "Morning, Gracie." Faith appeared on the porch, her apron dusted with chicken feed and a basket of fresh eggs balanced on her hip. At 20, she had their mother's gentle nature and healing touch. Even as a child, she could coax life back into wilting plants and calm frightened animals with a whispered word. "You've been out here since dawn." Grace closed the Bible carefully, protecting the pressed flowers. "Couldn't sleep much." None of us could. Faith settled on the porch steps, her brown hair catching copper highlights in the morning sun. "Hope made enough flapjacks to feed half the county. She cooks when she's worried, you know." That was Hope, 24 years old and blessed with their father's quick mind and love of learning. She'd taught herself advanced arithmetic and could read Latin well enough to help Doc Patterson with his medical texts. In a different world, with different circumstances, she might have become a teacher or even attended one of those new colleges for women back east. Instead, she'd been content to educate her younger sisters and dream quietly of possibilities that felt as distant as the stars. "Where's Charity?" Grace asked, noticing the unusual quiet from inside the house. "Still sleeping. Yesterday wore her out more than she'll admit." Faith's expression grew tender. She's trying so hard to be grown up, but she's still just 16. Charity was their surprise blessing, born when Grace was already 12 and helping their mother with household duties. She'd grown up surrounded by the love and protection of her 3 older sisters, but life had a way of forcing children to mature faster than their hearts were ready. Since their father's death 6 months ago, Charity had taken on responsibilities that should have remained years in her future. The sound of hoofbeats interrupted Grace's thoughts. A lone rider approached from the direction of town, and even at a distance, she recognized the straight posture and measured gait that could only belong to Clayton Rourke. Her stomach tightened with a mixture of gratitude and unease that she couldn't quite explain. Clayton Rourke was something of a legend in these parts. He'd arrived in Montana Territory 15 years ago with nothing but a horse, a saddle, and what folks said was an uncanny ability to spot good cattle land. Within 5 years, he'd built the largest ranch operation in 3 counties. Within 10, he was buying out smaller spreads and consolidating his holdings into an empire that stretched from the foothills to the river valley. What made Clayton unusual wasn't just his wealth. Plenty of men had gotten rich during the territory's boom years. It was his solitary nature that set tongues wagging. He lived alone in a sprawling ranch house that could have housed 3 families comfortably. He employed dozens of cowboys but took his meals in solitude. He attended church but sat in the back pew and left immediately after the final hymn. In 15 years, no one in Bitter Creek could claim to truly know Clayton Rourke. Until yesterday. "Faith, go, help Hope with breakfast," Grace said, rising from the rocking chair. "I'll handle this." "You sure?" Faith's protective instincts were showing. Despite being the 3rd eldest, she often acted as mediator between Grace's fierce independence and the world's complications. "We could all come out." "No." Grace smoothed her skirts and checked that her hair was properly pinned. Pride was about all she had left, and she wouldn't meet their mysterious benefactor looking less than dignified. "This is my responsibility." Clayton dismounted at the gate, removing his hat as Grace approached. He was a tall man, probably in his late 30s, with silver threading through dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting against prairie sun. His clothes were well made but practical, nothing fancy, nothing that screamed wealth except for the quality of the leather and the care with which everything was maintained. "Miss Carver." His voice was quiet, respectful. "I hope you don't mind the early visit. I wanted to speak with you before town started stirring." Grace stopped several feet away, close enough for conversation, but far enough to maintain proper distance. "Mr. Rourke, I suppose I should thank you for yesterday, though I'm still not entirely sure what to make of it." A ghost of a smile crossed his weathered features. "I reckon that's fair. It's not every day someone hands over a deed without explanation." "No, it's not." Grace studied his face, looking for some clue to his motivations. "The question is why. Men don't usually part with that kind of money unless they expect something in return." Clayton's expression grew serious. "Your father was a good man, Miss Carver. One of the finest I've known. When I heard about the auction, about you girls losing everything." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Let's just say I owed your family a debt." "What kind of debt?" "The kind that can't be repaid with money." Clayton turned his hat in his hands, a gesture that somehow made this powerful man seem almost vulnerable. "Tom Carver saved my life once, though he probably never thought of it that way. Sometimes a man needs to return kindness when he has the chance." Grace felt her skepticism wavering. There was something in his voice, a depth of emotion that couldn't be manufactured. but accepting charity, even well-meaning charity, stuck in her throat like a bone. "We're grateful, truly," she said finally, "but we can't accept—" "You're not accepting anything," Clayton interrupted gently. "The land is yours, free and clear. Your grandfather claimed it, your father improved it, and you girls belong on it. Yesterday's auction was just me, making sure things ended up where they should be." Hope appeared on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "Grace? Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine," Grace called back, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. She looked at Clayton again, noting how his eyes softened when he glanced toward the house, toward her sister. "Would you like coffee? Hope made extra." Clayton hesitated. "I don't want to impose. After what you did yesterday, I think we can spare a cup of coffee." Grace surprised herself with the invitation. Something about this man's quiet dignity made her want to understand him better. As they walked toward the house, Clayton spoke again. "I know this situation is unusual, Miss Carver. I know you have questions, and probably concerns about what folks in town might say. But I want you to know that my only interest is seeing you and your sisters secure on this land that's rightfully yours." Grace paused at the bottom of the porch steps. "And after that? What then, Mr. Rourke?" "After that," Clayton said simply, "you won't see much of me unless you have need. I'm not looking to interfere in your lives or make you beholden. I just wanted to set things right." But as Grace led him up the steps toward the warm glow of the kitchen and the sound of her sisters' voices, she found herself wondering if setting things right might be more complicated than either of them imagined. The kitchen fell silent when Grace entered with Clayton behind her. Hope stood frozen at the stove, a wooden spoon dripping batter back into the bowl, while Faith clutched her basket of eggs against her chest. Even Charity, who had apparently awakened and dressed quickly, stood in the doorway leading to the bedrooms with wide, uncertain eyes. "Girls," Grace said, her voice carefully neutral, "this is Mr. Clayton Rourke. He's the gentleman who—" She paused, still struggling with how to explain yesterday's extraordinary events. "Who helped us yesterday?" Clayton removed his hat completely, revealing hair that was more silver than Grace had noticed outside. "Ladies, I'm pleased to meet you all properly." Hope found her voice first, as she usually did. "Mr. Rourke, would you like some coffee? And breakfast? I've made plenty." Her natural hospitality overcame her surprise, though Grace noticed how her sister's hands trembled slightly as she reached for another plate. "Coffee would be fine, thank you," Clayton said, accepting Hope's invitation, but declining food. "I don't want to intrude on your family time." "You're not intruding," Charity piped up, earning a sharp look from Grace. At 16, their youngest sister had always been the most trusting, the quickest to see good in strangers. "Are you really the richest man in Montana?" "Charity," Faith scolded, her cheeks flushing pink with embarrassment. But Clayton chuckled, a warm sound that seemed to ease some of the tension in the room. "I've been blessed with success in cattle ranching, Miss Charity, though I wouldn't put much stock in what folks say about wealth. A man's worth isn't measured in dollars." Grace watched this exchange with growing curiosity. There was nothing of the cold businessman in Clayton's manner, no superiority, no condescension. He spoke to Charity as if her opinion mattered, as if she were an adult, worthy of honest conversation. They gathered around the kitchen table, a sturdy piece that Tom Carver had built himself during the early years of his marriage. Grace found herself studying Clayton's hands as he accepted a steaming mug of coffee, work roughened despite his wealth, with old scars that spoke of years handling cattle and horses. These weren't the soft hands of a man who let others do his labor. "Mr. Rourke," Hope began tentatively, "Grace said you knew our father." Clayton's expression grew solemn. "I did. Not well, perhaps, but well enough to respect him greatly." He took a sip of coffee, considering his words. "This was maybe 10 years back. I'd had some trouble with rustlers hitting my northern pastures, and Tom was the one who tracked them down. Could have been a dangerous situation, but he handled it with such fairness and wisdom that even the thieves admitted they'd been wrong." "That sounds like Papa," Faith said softly. "He always said, justice should come with mercy when possible." "Exactly." Clayton's eyes warmed with the memory. "But it was after the arrests, when he came to tell me the matter was settled, that I really saw his character. He could have accepted a reward. Lord knows I offered one. But instead, he asked if I might consider hiring one of the young men involved. Said the boy had just made bad choices because his family was desperate." Grace felt her throat tighten. She remembered that incident, remembered her father coming home late and telling their mother that sometimes people needed second chances more than punishment. "Did you hire him?" Charity asked, leaning forward with interest. "I did. Johnny Martinez. He's my foreman now, married with 3 children and the finest cowhand I've ever employed." Clayton met Grace's eyes across the table. "Your father taught me something that day about the value of compassion. It's a lesson that served me well over the years." The deed. Grace suddenly understood why Clayton carried it in his vest pocket, why he'd drawn it out so deliberately at the auction. This wasn't impulse or charity. This was a debt of honor being repaid. "So when you heard about the auction," Grace said slowly, "you felt obligated." "Not obligated," Clayton corrected gently. "Honored. Honored to have the chance to ensure Tom Carver's daughters kept their heritage." Hope refilled his coffee without being asked, a gesture of acceptance that Grace noted with mixed feelings. Her sisters were warming to this man, but Grace couldn't shake the feeling that accepting his generosity would change their lives in ways they couldn't predict. "What about the town?" she asked. "People are going to talk. They're going to wonder what you expect from us in return." Clayton's jaw tightened slightly, the first sign of real emotion he'd shown. "Let them talk. Anyone who knows your family knows their character. Anyone who knows mine knows I don't make deals that leave ladies beholden." "But some people will assume," Grace began. "Some people assume the worst about everything," Faith interrupted, surprising them all with her firmness. "That doesn't mean we should live our lives afraid of gossip." Charity nodded enthusiastically. "Besides, what Mr. Rourke did was wonderful. Why should we care what mean-spirited people think?" Grace looked around the table at her sisters' faces, Hope thoughtful and protective, Faith gentle but determined, Charity bright with optimism. They were right, of course. They were also young enough to believe that good intentions could shield them from harsh realities. "I appreciate your concern for our reputation, Miss Carver," Clayton said, reading her thoughts with uncomfortable accuracy. "But I'm not worried about mine, and you shouldn't be worried about yours. Your family's good name is built on years of honorable living. One act of kindness, whether giving or receiving, won't change that." "You speak as if kindness is simple," Grace replied, "as if accepting help doesn't come with obligations." Clayton was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that made everyone listen more carefully. "Help can come with obligations, that's true. But gifts, real gifts, come with only one requirement, that they be received with the spirit in which they're given." He paused. "I'm not offering help, Miss Carver. I'm not offering a loan or a partnership or any arrangement that puts you in my debt. I'm giving you what should have been yours all along." "Why?" The word came out more harshly than Grace intended. "Why does it matter to you what happens to us?" For the first time since entering their kitchen, Clayton looked uncertain. He glanced at the windows, at the coffee cup in his hands, anywhere but at the 4 pairs of eyes watching him. "Because," he said finally, "there was a time when someone's kindness saved my life, and I never got the chance to repay it. Because your father was the kind of man who made the world a little better just by being in it. And because—" He stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. "Because," Hope prompted gently. Clayton met Grace's eyes directly. "Because sometimes a man gets tired of being alone, and helping good people is the closest thing to family he's likely to find." The honesty in his voice cut through Grace's defenses like a blade through silk. Here was the truth she'd been looking for, not obligation or charity, but loneliness seeking purpose. She recognized it because she'd felt it herself, carrying the weight of family responsibility without anyone to share the burden. "The deed," she said quietly. "May I see it again?" Clayton reached into his vest pocket and withdrew the folded document, placing it on the table between them. Grace picked it up with careful hands, reading her own name written in legal script that made their ownership official and unshakable. "It really is ours," Faith whispered, as if speaking too loudly might break the spell. "It really is," Clayton confirmed. "And now, if you'll permit me, I should be getting back to my own place. I've got cattle to check and hands to supervise." He rose from the table, and Grace noticed how he moved, careful not to seem threatening, respectful of their space. This was a man who understood that his size and wealth could intimidate, who chose his actions to put others at ease. "Mr. Rourke," Grace said, as he reached for his hat. "Will we see you again?" The question surprised her. She hadn't planned to ask it. Clayton paused, his hand on the hat brim. "Would you like to?" Grace looked at her sisters, seeing hope and curiosity in their faces. Despite her wariness, she found herself nodding. "Then yes," Clayton said simply. "You'll see me again." 3 days passed before Clayton returned, and Grace found herself listening for hoofbeats each morning as she completed her chores. Not anxiously, she told herself, simply aware. The way one might notice when the morning bird stopped singing or when storm clouds gathered on the horizon. The sisters had fallen into their familiar rhythm of survival, each taking on responsibilities that kept their small household functioning. Grace managed the finances and heavy labor, Hope handled cooking and planning, Faith tended their modest garden and the few chickens they'd managed to keep after the auction, and Charity helped wherever extra hands were needed. But something had changed since Clayton's visit. There was a lightness in their conversations, a cautious hope that hadn't existed since their father's death. The deed sat in their mother's old jewelry box like a talisman, proof that their world hadn't completely crumbled. "Grace, look what I found!" Charity burst through the kitchen door, her cheeks flushed from excitement and morning air. In her hands, she carried a small wooden horse, carved with the careful detail that spoke of patient craftsmanship and loving attention. Grace recognized it immediately. Their father had carved it when Charity was barely walking, spending long winter evenings with his knife and a piece of oak, creating something beautiful for his youngest daughter. It had been Charity's constant companion until she'd outgrown such things, and everyone had assumed it was lost during the auction. "Where did you find it?" Hope asked, setting down her dish rag to examine the little horse. "In the barn loft, wedged behind a beam." Charity's eyes sparkled with the joy of recovering something precious. "I was looking for that old harness Papa mentioned, the one he said might be worth repairing. And there it was, like it was waiting for me to come back. Faith smiled, running her finger along the horse's carved mane. Mama used to say you talked to that horse like it was real. You'd carry it everywhere, whispering secrets in its ear. I still remember some of those secrets, Charity said with a laugh that sounded younger than her 16 years. I used to tell it about the adventures we'd have when I grew up, all the places we'd see together. And now, Grace asked gently, noting how Charity clutched the toy against her chest. Now I think I'd rather stay here and help make this place everything Papa dreamed it could be. Charity's expression grew serious, showing the maturity that life had forced upon her. This is home, Grace. This is where we belong. Grace felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the weight of being responsible for her sister's happiness, for making dreams come true with empty pockets and stubborn determination. The wooden horse represented simpler times, when their biggest worry was whether Charity would lose her favorite toy in the tall grass behind the house. "We'll make it work," she said, as much to convince herself as her sisters. "Somehow, we'll find a way to—" The sound of approaching horses interrupted her promise. But this time, it wasn't the measured gait of a single rider. Multiple horses, moving at a working pace, were coming up their lane. Through the kitchen window, Grace saw Clayton leading a small group of men, each mounted and several pulling loaded pack mules behind them. Her stomach clenched with sudden anxiety. Had he changed his mind? Was he coming to claim the property after all? "Stay inside," she told her sisters, straightening her shoulders and preparing for whatever confrontation awaited. But when she stepped onto the porch, Clayton touched his hat brim in greeting and dismounted with the same respectful manner he'd shown before. "Morning, Miss Carver. I hope we're not disturbing you too much." "That depends on what you're doing here," Grace replied, watching as his men began unloading supplies from the pack animals: lumber, tools, rolls of wire that gleamed in the sunlight. "Noticed your well pump needs attention," Clayton said, nodding toward the contraption that had been giving them trouble for weeks. "Also saw that the east fence line has some gaps that might let livestock wander. Thought we could take care of those issues while we're between major ranch work." Grace's pride flared immediately. "Mr. Rourke, we didn't ask for—" "No, you didn't," he agreed calmly. "But neighbors help neighbors, and that pump's going to fail completely if the leather washers aren't replaced soon. You'll have a hard time managing without good water." "We can manage fine," Grace said, even as she recognized the truth in his assessment. The pump had been growing increasingly unreliable, and she had no idea how to repair it herself. One of Clayton's men, a compact Mexican fellow with intelligent eyes and capable hands, approached carrying a toolbox. "Señorita, I am Johnny Martinez. This pump, she is easy to fix if you have the right parts. Mr. Clayton, he asked me to bring what is needed." Grace remembered the name from Clayton's story about her father. The young man, Tom Carver, had helped find honest work instead of punishment. She studied Johnny's face, seeing respect and genuine concern rather than charity or condescension. "How much will the repairs cost?" she asked, directing the question to Clayton. "Cost is already taken care of," he replied. "Consider it part of maintaining the property value. A homestead with a good well is worth more than one without." It was a clever way to frame the assistance, not charity, but practical investment. Grace found herself appreciating his thoughtfulness, even as her independence rebelled against accepting help. Hope appeared on the porch, drawn by curiosity, despite Grace's instruction to stay inside. "Mr. Rourke, would you and your men like coffee? It's no trouble to make a pot." "That's very kind, Miss Hope. We'd be grateful." Clayton's smile was warm but not presumptuous. We'll try not to disrupt your day too much. Most of this work can be done without getting in your way." As the men dispersed to their tasks, Grace found herself standing beside Clayton, watching Johnny examine the pump mechanism with practiced expertise. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly, aware that her sisters might be listening from inside the house. "I know," Clayton replied, "but I want to. And before you ask why, again, let me say this. Sometimes helping others is the only way a man can help himself." Grace glanced at his profile, noting the lines of weariness around his eyes, the way his shoulders carried invisible weight. "What kind of help do you need, Mr. Rourke?" He was quiet for a long moment, watching his men work with the efficient coordination of a well-managed crew. The kind that comes from knowing you've done something worthwhile. The kind that reminds you what it feels like to be part of something good. Before Grace could respond, Charity bounded onto the porch, the wooden horse still clutched in her hand. She stopped short when she saw the activity in the yard, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Oh, hello again, Mr. Rourke." She tucked the toy behind her back, suddenly self-conscious about carrying it. "Miss Charity, what have you got there?" Charity hesitated, looking to Grace for guidance. At Grace's nod, she brought the horse forward. "It's silly, probably, but I found my old toy. Papa carved it for me when I was little." Clayton examined the wooden horse with the same careful attention he might give to a valuable piece of art. "That's beautiful work. Your father was a skilled craftsman." "He made things for all of us over the years," Charity said, warming to the subject. "Grace has a jewelry box with roses carved on the lid, and Hope has bookends shaped like owls. Faith's got a medicine box with different compartments for her herbs. A man who creates beauty for his family is a man who understands what matters," Clayton said, handing the horse back to Charity with gentle care. "That's a treasure, worth keeping safe." Grace watched this exchange with growing bewilderment. Everything about Clayton Rourke challenged her expectations. His gentleness with Charity, his respect for their father's memory, his ability to help without making them feel diminished. She'd built her defenses against the wrong kind of man entirely. By midday, the well pump was singing with smooth, reliable operation, and the east fence gleamed with new wire and sturdy posts. Clayton's men worked with quiet efficiency, completing tasks that would have taken Grace weeks to attempt, if she'd known how to attempt them at all. "Lunch is ready," Hope called from the porch, her voice carrying the warmth that came naturally when she was feeding people. She'd prepared enough food to feed Clayton's entire crew, despite Grace's protests that they couldn't afford such generosity. "We can't send working men away hungry," Hope had said firmly. "Mama would roll over in her grave if we showed such poor hospitality." Now the men gathered around the kitchen table and spilled onto the porch, sharing ham sandwiches, fresh-baked bread, and the last of the preserves their mother had canned before her death. Grace watched Clayton interact with his crew, noting how they respected him without fear, a sign of good leadership that spoke well of his character. After the meal, as the men returned to their work, Faith disappeared into the house and emerged carrying their mother's old jewelry box. The carved roses on the lid caught the afternoon sunlight, each petal detailed with the same loving care Tom Carver had put into Charity's wooden horse. "Grace, I found something," Faith said softly, setting the box on the porch table. "I was putting Mama's Bible away properly, and I felt something loose in the bottom." She opened a hidden compartment Grace had never known existed, revealing a small wrapped bundle nestled in faded velvet. Faith unwrapped it carefully, exposing a delicate gold ring set with a modest but beautiful pearl. "Mama's wedding ring," Grace breathed, reaching out to touch the precious metal. But Papa said he had to sell it to pay for medicine, Faith finished. But look. She lifted the ring, revealing an inscription on the inside of the band. It says, "With all my love, Thomas. Forever yours, Sarah." Hope moved closer, her eyes bright with unshed tears. He couldn't bear to sell it, even when things got so desperate. He must have hidden it before he got sick, Charity added, her voice hushed with reverence. He wanted us to have something of Mama's. Grace took the ring with trembling hands, feeling the weight of 25 years of marriage, of promises kept, and love endured through hardship. Her parents had been so young when they married. Sarah barely 18, Tom 21, and fresh from the war. This ring represented their beginning, their hope, their faith in each other. "It should be yours, Grace," Faith said quietly. "You're the eldest, and you've been like a mother to us since—" "No." Grace shook her head firmly. "It belongs to all of us. Mama loved each of us equally." Clayton's voice interrupted their moment. "Ladies, I don't mean to intrude, but I couldn't help noticing." He paused, seeming to recognize the emotional weight of their discovery. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have—" "It's all right," Grace said, surprised by her willingness to include him in this private moment. "We just found our mother's wedding ring. Papa hid it before he died." Clayton's expression grew tender. "May I?" When Grace nodded, he examined the ring with respectful care. "Beautiful craftsmanship. Your father had excellent taste." "He saved for months to buy it," Hope said softly. "Mama told us the story once. He worked extra jobs, saved every penny, because he wanted her to have something beautiful to remember their wedding day." "Love like that doesn't come along often," Clayton said, returning the ring to Grace's palm. "Your parents were blessed to find each other." Grace noticed something in his voice, a wistfulness that suggested personal experience with loss. Before she could pursue the thought, Johnny Martinez approached, hat in hand. "Mr. Clayton, we are finished with the fence. Should we move to the barn roof next?" "The barn roof?" Grace asked, alarm creeping into her voice. "What's wrong with the barn roof?" Clayton looked uncomfortable. "There are some loose boards that'll let rain in come winter. Nothing urgent, but—" "We can't afford extensive repairs," Grace said quickly. "Mr. Rourke, I appreciate everything you've done. But we can't keep accepting. These aren't repairs," Clayton interrupted gently. "They're preventive maintenance. Much cheaper to fix small problems before they become big ones." Faith touched Grace's arm. "He's right, you know. Papa always said an ounce of prevention was worth a pound of cure. Besides," Charity added, with the practical wisdom that sometimes surprised them all, "if we're going to make this place profitable, we need buildings that don't leak." Grace looked around at her sisters' faces, seeing hope and determination where once there'd been only worry. Clayton had given them more than land ownership. He'd given them the possibility of a future. "How long will the roof work take?" she asked finally. "Couple hours," Johnny replied. "We brought extra shingles and nails. Easy work." As the afternoon wore on, Grace found herself working alongside Clayton, holding boards while he made measurements, passing tools when needed. His hands were sure and competent, and he moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to physical labor. "You don't act like most wealthy men I've heard about," Grace said, steadying a ladder while he climbed up to examine a section of roof. "How do wealthy men act?" Clayton asked, his voice muffled by concentration. "From a distance, with other people doing the work." Clayton paused, hammer in hand. "Money doesn't change what you are inside. It just gives you more choices about how to show it." "And what are you inside?" He was quiet for so long that Grace wondered if he'd heard the question. When he finally answered, his voice carried a weight of old pain. A man who lost everything that mattered once. A man trying to figure out how to live with that. Before Grace could respond, he'd moved to another section of roof, effectively ending the conversation. But his words lingered, adding another piece to the puzzle of Clayton Rourke. As evening approached and Clayton's men prepared to leave, Hope invited him to stay for supper. Grace held her breath, uncertain whether she wanted him to accept or decline. "I appreciate the invitation," Clayton said, "but I've imposed enough for one day." "You haven't imposed at all," Faith said warmly. "You've helped us more than we can repay." "Then let me ask for something in return," Clayton said, his eyes meeting Grace's. "Let me come back tomorrow evening for that supper invitation. Give me something to look forward to." Grace felt her heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with the growing awareness that Clayton Rourke was becoming important to her in ways she hadn't expected. "Tomorrow evening, then," she heard herself say. "We'll be expecting you." As Clayton and his men rode away in the gathering dusk, Grace stood on the porch, holding her mother's ring, watching until they disappeared beyond the ridge. The homestead felt different now, not just repaired, but somehow more hopeful. "He likes you," Charity said, appearing beside her with the wooden horse tucked under her arm. "Don't be silly." "I'm not being silly. I saw how he looked at you when he thought you weren't watching." Grace turned to study her youngest sister's face. "And how was that?" Charity grinned. "Like you were something precious he was afraid to touch." Clayton arrived the following evening precisely at sunset, carrying a bottle of wine and wearing clothes that spoke of careful consideration, clean but not fancy, respectful of the occasion, without making the sisters feel underdressed in their simple home. Grace had spent an embarrassing amount of time choosing her own dress, finally settling on the blue cotton that brought out her eyes. Supper was a revelation in domesticity. Clayton fit into their family rhythm as if he'd been joining them for years, helping clear plates without being asked, listening to Charity's chatter about her plans for the garden, engaging Hope in serious discussion about books and learning. He treated each sister as an individual worthy of attention, never condescending or dismissive. But it was his interaction with Faith that surprised Grace most. When Faith mentioned her interest in medicinal plants, Clayton leaned forward with genuine curiosity. "My grandmother was something of an herb woman back in Missouri," he said. "She could cure everything from headaches to heartbreak with things she grew in her garden." "Really?" Faith's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm she showed for anything related to healing. "Did she teach you any of her methods?" "A few. Willow bark tea for pain, chamomile for sleep, echinacea for infections." Clayton smiled at the memory. "She used to say that God put everything we needed right in the ground if we just knew how to look for it." "That's exactly what I believe," Faith said excitedly. "I've been reading Papa's old medical books, trying to match what the doctors prescribe with what grows wild around here. There's a place up in the foothills where wild ginseng grows," Clayton said thoughtfully, "and a meadow full of medicinal plants most folks walk right past. If you're interested, I could show you sometime." Grace watched this exchange with growing unease. Not because Clayton was inappropriate, quite the opposite. He was becoming too comfortable, too welcome, too much a part of their lives. What would happen when he tired of playing family with 4 orphaned sisters? What would happen when his interest in their little domestic drama faded? After supper, they sat on the porch as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold. Clayton had settled into their father's old chair with unconscious ease, while the sisters arranged themselves on the steps and remaining chairs. The scene felt so natural, so right, that it frightened Grace with its perfection. "Mr. Rourke," Hope said, during a comfortable lull in conversation, "may I ask you something personal?" "Of course. Why aren't you married? I mean, a successful man like yourself. Surely there have been opportunities." Grace shot her sister a warning look, but Clayton didn't seem offended by the directness. "There was someone once," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "My wife, Elizabeth. We lost her and our son in childbirth 7 years ago." The silence that followed was heavy with sympathy and understanding. Grace felt her heart clench with unexpected pain, not jealousy of a dead woman, but empathy for the loss that explained so much about Clayton's solitary existence. "I'm sorry," Faith said softly. "That must have been. It was the end of everything I thought I wanted from life," Clayton said simply. "For a long time afterward, I couldn't see the point in building anything or caring about anything. Work was all I had left." "And now?" Grace asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Clayton looked at her directly, his eyes holding depths of emotion that made her breath catch. "Now I'm beginning to remember what it feels like to hope again." The moment stretched between them, charged with possibilities that both thrilled and terrified Grace. This man had lost everything once. What guarantee did they have that he wouldn't decide their simple domestic happiness was too risky to pursue? The sound of approaching horses shattered the peaceful evening. But these weren't the measured hoofbeats of friends or neighbors. These horses moved with urgency, their riders pushing hard toward the homestead. Clayton was on his feet instantly, his relaxed demeanor replaced by alert tension. "Ladies, go inside, now." "What's wrong?" Charity asked, but she obeyed along with her sisters, though they remained near the windows where they could see and hear. 3 men rode into the yard, their horses lathered from hard travel. Grace recognized the leader, Silas Blackwood, a land speculator who'd been circling struggling homesteads like a vulture for years. His companions were strangers, but they had the look of men accustomed to getting their way through intimidation. "Rourke," Blackwood called out, not bothering to dismount. "Heard you made an interesting purchase at the Carver auction." "News travels fast," Clayton replied, his voice carefully neutral. Grace noticed how he positioned himself between the riders and the house, his hand resting casually near the gun on his hip. "Fast enough. Question is, why would a smart businessman like you throw good money away on worthless dirt?" "Maybe I don't consider it worthless," Blackwood laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "Come now, Clayton. We both know these girls can't work this land properly. It'll be back on the auction block within a year when they can't pay taxes or handle the next crisis that comes along." Grace's temper flared at the casual dismissal of their capabilities, but Clayton's steady presence kept her from rushing outside to defend herself. "I'd say that's their business, not yours," Clayton said evenly. "Actually, it's becoming my business. I've been authorized to make an offer on this property, a generous offer that would set these ladies up comfortably in town while putting the land to proper use." "Authorized by whom?" "Let's just say there are parties interested in consolidating holdings in this valley. Parties with more resources than sentiment." Clayton's stance shifted slightly, and Grace realized he was preparing for trouble. From inside the house, she could see the Winchester rifle hanging above the fireplace, her father's service weapon, cleaned and maintained, but rarely used since his death. "I think you should leave," Clayton said, his voice carrying quiet authority. "This property belongs to the Carver family, and they're not interested in selling." "You sure about that?" One of Blackwood's companions spoke up. "Winter's coming, and winter's hard on folks who aren't prepared. Accidents happen. Buildings catch fire. People get hurt." The threat was unmistakable, and Grace saw Clayton's hand move closer to his weapon. Without conscious thought, She slipped away from the window and retrieved her father's rifle, checking that it was loaded. Behind her, she heard Hope's sharp intake of breath. "Grace, what are you doing?" "What Papa would have done," Grace said grimly. "Protecting our home." She stepped onto the porch, the rifle held with competent familiarity. Her father had taught all his daughters to shoot, though he'd hoped they'd never need the skill for anything more serious than hunting rabbits. "Gentlemen," she said clearly, "you're on private property without invitation. I suggest you leave before this conversation becomes unpleasant." Blackwood's eyes narrowed as he took in the sight of an armed woman who clearly knew how to use her weapon. "Miss Carver, there's no need for—" "There's every need," Grace interrupted. "You've made threats against my family and our property. In Montana territory, that gives me legal right to defend both." Clayton glanced back at her, with what might have been admiration mixed with concern. "Miss Carver's right, Blackwood. You've overplayed your hand." "This isn't over," Blackwood said, wheeling his horse around. "Winter changes a lot of minds about what's possible." As the three men rode away, Grace felt the adrenaline drain from her system, leaving her hands slightly shaky. Clayton turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "That was either very brave or very foolish," he said. "Sometimes they're the same thing," Grace replied, lowering the rifle but not moving to put it away. "Those men meant business, didn't they?" "I'm afraid so." Clayton's jaw was tight with anger, not at her, but at the situation. "Blackwood doesn't make idle threats." "Then we'll be ready for him." The next morning brought an unexpected gift that helped ease the tension from the previous night's confrontation. Faith burst into the kitchen, carrying an armload of wildflowers, her face glowing with excitement and discovery. "Look what I found, pressed between the pages of Mama's recipe book," she said, carefully spreading delicate specimens across the kitchen table. Each flower had been preserved with meticulous care: violets, wild roses, Indian paintbrush, and mountain lupine, their colors still vibrant despite years of careful pressing. Grace recognized her mother's handiwork immediately. Sarah Carver had possessed an artist's eye for beauty and a naturalist's appreciation for the healing properties of plants. These pressed flowers represented hours of patient collection and preservation, a hobby that had given her joy during the long winter months when outdoor work was impossible. "Mama always said flowers held God's promises," Hope murmured, touching a delicate rose petal with reverent fingers. "She used to tell us that even when everything else seemed dark, wildflowers would bloom again come spring." "There are notes written beside some of them," Faith continued, producing a small leather journal. "Look, she documented where she found each one, when it blooms, what medicinal properties it has. It's like having a guide to every healing plant in the territory." Charity leaned over Faith's shoulder, reading their mother's careful script. "Listen to this. Mountain lupine, gathered near Eagle Creek, July 15th. Tea from the leaves soothes troubled nerves and brings peaceful sleep. Remember, God provides remedies for every affliction of body and spirit." The discovery felt like a message from beyond, a reminder that beauty and healing could persist through the darkest times. Grace thought of Clayton's revelation about his grandmother's herb knowledge and wondered if this was more than mere coincidence. "We should show this to Mr. Rourke," Faith said, echoing Grace's thoughts. "He might be able to help us find some of these plants." "Mr. Rourke has his own concerns," Grace replied, though not as sharply as she might have a week ago. "We can't keep depending on him for everything." "But he offered to help," Charity pointed out with teenage logic. "And Faith needs to learn about these plants if she's going to become a real healer like Mama was." Before Grace could respond, the sound of a single horse approaching interrupted their conversation. Through the window they saw Clayton riding toward the house at an easy pace, but something in his posture suggested urgency beneath the calm exterior. "Ladies," he said, dismounting and approaching the porch with purposeful strides, "I need to speak with you about last night." "Come in," Grace said, stepping aside to let him enter. "Faith has something that might interest you." Clayton's expression softened as Faith explained her discovery, showing him the pressed flowers and their mother's careful notes. He examined each specimen with knowledgeable attention, occasionally nodding or making quiet sounds of recognition. "Your mother was remarkably skilled," he said finally. "Some of these combinations would rival anything a trained physician could prescribe." "Could you really show us where to find these plants?" Faith asked hopefully. "I could, but that's not why I'm here this morning." Clayton's expression grew serious. "I made some inquiries about Blackwood and his associates. The situation is more complicated than I initially thought." Grace felt her stomach tighten with apprehension. "What kind of complicated?" "There's a consortium of Eastern investors looking to buy up large tracts of land in this valley for cattle operations. They're offering substantial sums to current landowners, but they're not above using pressure tactics when generosity fails." "Pressure tactics," Hope repeated. "You mean threats?" "I mean whatever it takes to acquire the properties they want. Blackwood is just their local representative." Grace absorbed this information with growing anger. "So they think they can intimidate us into selling land that's rightfully ours? They think you're 4 women alone with no protection and limited resources. They think you'll be grateful for any offer that lets you walk away with dignity intact." "They think wrong," Grace said flatly. Clayton studied her face with something that might have been admiration. "I believe they do. But Grace—" "May I call you Grace? You need to understand what you're facing. These aren't local bullies you can run off with a rifle. They have money, legal connections, and patience. They'll wait for winter to wear you down, for the next crisis to break your resolve." "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting you don't have to face this alone." Clayton's voice carried a weight of unspoken meaning. "You have options." Grace felt her sister's attention focus on this exchange like a physical pressure. Whatever Clayton was about to propose would change their situation fundamentally. "What kind of options?" "Marriage." The word fell into the kitchen like a stone into still water. "A legal union that would give you the protection of my name and resources while preserving your independence and your sister's security." The silence that followed was deafening. Grace stared at Clayton, trying to process what he'd just suggested. Not a proposal of love, but a business arrangement designed to solve their mutual problems. "You're suggesting a marriage of convenience," she said carefully. "I'm suggesting a partnership that could benefit us both. You need protection and resources. I need—" He paused, seeming to struggle with the admission. "I need a purpose beyond accumulating wealth. I need a reason to care about tomorrow." Hope cleared her throat delicately. "Perhaps Faith, Charity, and I should step outside for a moment." "No," Grace said quickly. "Whatever decision I make affects all of us. You have a right to hear this conversation." Clayton nodded approvingly. "Your sister's welfare is obviously your primary concern. They'd be welcome in my home, our home, as long as they wish to stay. Hope could have access to all the books and educational opportunities she desires. Faith could develop her healing practice with proper supplies and training. Charity could grow up with every advantage I can provide." "And what would you get out of this arrangement?" Grace asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. "A family," Clayton said simply. "The chance to be part of something meaningful again. the knowledge that my wealth serves a purpose beyond my own comfort. Charity, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly spoke up. "Do you love Grace?" The directness of the question seemed to surprise Clayton, but he answered with equal honesty. "I care for her deeply, and that caring grows stronger each day." "Love?" He looked at Grace with an expression that made her heart race. "Love might come, given time and patience." "And if it doesn't," Grace asked, "then we'd still have partnership, respect, and shared purpose. Many successful marriages have been built on less." Grace felt the weight of decision settling on her shoulders. This wasn't the romantic proposal she might have dreamed of as a young girl, but it wasn't entirely without hope either. Clayton was offering security, protection, and the possibility of love. He was also offering her sisters a future that her pride alone could never provide. "I need time to think," she said finally. "Of course. But Grace, don't take too long. Blackwood won't wait indefinitely, and winter approaches whether we're ready or not." After Clayton left, the sisters sat around the kitchen table, surrounded by their mother's pressed flowers, each lost in private thoughts about the choice that would determine their future. 3 days of careful consideration had passed when Faith made a discovery that changed everything. She'd been organizing their father's papers, preparing to store them safely in the family Bible, when she found a hidden compartment in his old desk, one that contained a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. "Grace, you need to see this," Faith called from the parlor, her voice tight with emotion that could have been excitement or distress. Grace hurried from the kitchen, where she'd been wrestling with bread dough and her own conflicted thoughts about Clayton's proposal. Hope and charity followed, drawn by the urgency in Faith's tone. The letters lay spread across the desk, like evidence of some long-hidden crime. Grace recognized Clayton's handwriting immediately, though these pages bore dates spanning several years, some as recent as 3 months ago, others going back nearly 2 years. "These are all addressed to Papa," Faith said quietly. "And they're all from Mr. Rourke." With trembling hands, Grace picked up the most recent letter, dated just 1 month before their father's death. Clayton's careful script revealed truths that made her stomach clench with a mixture of betrayal and understanding. "Tom, I know your pride makes it difficult to accept help, but please don't let stubbornness prevent you from caring for your family. The money I've arranged to have deposited with Banker Mills is not charity. It's payment for services you've provided over the years. Your advice on range management alone has saved me thousands in cattle losses. Please use these funds for Sarah's medical bills without concern for repayment." Grace sank into a chair, the implications washing over her like cold water. She picked up another letter, this one older. "Tom, I was sorry to hear about Sarah's passing. Please accept my condolences and know that if you or the girls need anything at all, you have only to ask. I remember how Sarah used to send food to the line camps during harsh winters. Such kindness should be returned in kind." Hope read over Grace's shoulder, her voice barely a whisper. "He's been helping us for years." "Papa never said." "Papa's pride wouldn't let him say," Grace replied bitterly, understanding her father's dilemma all too well. She picked up another letter, finding more evidence of Clayton's quiet generosity. "Tom, I've heard rumors that Blackwood is pressuring small landowners to sell. If he approaches you, please know that you have options. I would consider it an honor to ensure your family's security, whatever form that might take. Your friendship has meant more to me than you know, especially during the dark years after Elizabeth's death." Charity, who had been reading silently, looked up with confused eyes. "I don't understand. If Mr. Rourke was helping us all along, why didn't Papa tell us?" "Because Papa was proud," Faith said softly, and because accepting help from a man like Mr. Rourke would have felt like admitting he couldn't provide for his own family. Grace continued reading, finding letter after letter that revealed the depth of Clayton's concern for their welfare. There were arrangements for medical care, anonymous payments to cover debts, even correspondence about potential suitors for the older girls, all handled with such discretion that the family had remained unaware of his involvement. The final letter, written just days before their father's death, contained the most shocking revelation of all. My dear friend Tom, I fear this may be my last opportunity to write to you. Dr. Patterson tells me your condition is worsening, and I know your greatest concern is for your daughter's future. Please know that I will honor our agreement. Grace, hope, faith, and charity will never want for protection or provision as long as I draw breath. The promise I made to you and Sarah years ago remains as binding today as when it was first spoken. Your girls will have every opportunity to choose their own paths in life, free from the desperation that forces hasty decisions. This I swear on Elizabeth's memory. Agreement? Hope said, her voice sharp with confusion. What agreement? Grace felt the world shifting beneath her feet. Every kindness Clayton had shown them, every gesture of generosity, had been orchestrated not by growing affection, but by a promise made to their dying father. Their budding relationship, her tentative feelings of attraction and trust, it had all been built on a foundation of obligation and pity. There's more, Faith said reluctantly, producing a letter in their father's handwriting. This is Papa's response to the last one. It was never sent. I found it in the desk blotter. Grace read her father's words with growing anguish. Clayton, I cannot express my gratitude for your friendship and generosity over these difficult years. You have been the brother I never had, the friend any man would be proud to claim. My greatest regret is that I will not live to repay your kindness, but I take comfort in knowing my girls will have your protection. Grace is strong but stubborn. She will resist help unless it comes disguised as something else. Hope dreams of education and will thrive with proper encouragement. Faith has Sarah's healing gift and needs only guidance to develop it fully. Charity is our joy and surprise. Please see that she has the chance to remain young a while longer. I know you understand the weight of responsibility I'm placing on you, but you are the only man I trust completely with my daughter's welfare. If circumstances permit and affection grows naturally, Grace would make a fine wife for a man worthy of her. But please, never let obligation drive such decisions. She deserves to be loved, not merely protected. The letter slipped from Grace's nerveless fingers. Everything made terrible, perfect sense now. Clayton's appearance at the auction, his immediate willingness to help, his careful courtship of the entire family, it had all been duty. Even his marriage proposal wasn't prompted by genuine feeling, but by the need to fulfill a promise to a dying friend. Grace, Hope said gently, reaching for her sister's hand. Maybe it's not what you think. It's exactly what I think, Grace said, her voice hollow with disappointment. We've been a project, a responsibility he inherited, along with Papa's last wishes. But he cares about us, Charity protested. I can see it when he looks at you especially. That's not duty. How can you tell the difference? Grace asked sharply. How can any of us know what's real when everything we've experienced has been built on obligation? Faith, who had been quietly reading the remaining letters, looked up with troubled eyes. There's something else. The last letter mentions that other men have asked Papa about courting you and Hope. Mr. Rourke advised Papa to be cautious, to make sure any suitors were worthy and sincere. Grace laughed bitterly. Of course he did. Can't have his charges marrying unsuitable men. That would reflect poorly on his guardianship. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their painful revelations. Through the window they could see Clayton riding toward the house with his usual measured pace, apparently coming for Grace's answer to his marriage proposal. "What are you going to do?" Hope asked anxiously. Grace stood, straightening her shoulders with the pride that had sustained her through every crisis since their mother's death. "I'm going to thank Mr. Rourke for his faithful service to Papa's memory and release him from any further obligation to our welfare." "Grace, you can't," Faith began. "I can and I will." Grace's voice carried final determination. "We've managed to survive this long on our own. We'll continue to do so. But what about Blackwood? What about the threats? We'll face them as a family, without false protection built on pity and duty." Grace walked to the window, watching Clayton dismount with the same careful respect he'd shown from their first meeting. Everything about him, his gentleness, his consideration, his growing presence in their lives, suddenly felt tainted by the knowledge that it stemmed from obligation rather than choice. When he knocked, she would answer with dignity intact. She would thank him politely and send him away, freeing them both from the burden of an arrangement that had never been what she'd hoped. But as she watched him approach, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to make the biggest mistake of her life. Grace answered Clayton's knock with a composure that belied the turmoil in her heart. He stood on the porch, holding a small wrapped package, his expression hopeful in a way that made her task even more difficult. "Good afternoon, Grace. I brought something I thought you might appreciate." He offered the package with a smile that faded when he saw her face. "What's wrong?" "Please come in, Mr. Rourke. We need to talk." Clayton followed her into the parlor, where the letters still lay scattered across the desk like accusations. His steps slowed as he recognized his own handwriting, his face growing pale as understanding dawned. "You found them," he said quietly. "We found them." Grace's voice carried a chill that made him flinch. "All of them. Years of correspondence that you and Papa kept secret from us." Clayton set the package on a side table and moved toward the desk, but Grace stepped into his path. Don't try to explain or justify what amounts to years of deception." "Grace, please listen. I've listened enough. I've listened to your stories about knowing Papa, about respecting him, about wanting to help us. What I haven't heard is the truth, that everything you've done has been motivated by a promise to a dying man, rather than any genuine feeling for us." Clayton's jaw tightened with what might have been pain or frustration. "That's not entirely accurate, isn't it? These letters document years of financial assistance, arrangements for our welfare, even recommendations about potential suitors. We've been your project, Mr. Rourke, your obligation." Hope, Faith, and Charity had withdrawn to the kitchen, but Grace could feel their attention focused on this confrontation that would determine all their futures. "Yes, I promised your father I would look after you," Clayton said, his voice steady despite the storm in his eyes. "Yes, I've been helping your family longer than you knew, but if you think obligation is all that brought me here, you're wrong." "Am I? Then tell me, would you have bought that deed if Papa hadn't extracted a promise from you? Would you have shown the slightest interest in 4 struggling sisters if duty hadn't demanded it?" Clayton was quiet for a long moment, and Grace felt her heart break a little more with his silence. "I don't know," he said finally. "I can't separate what began as duty from what became genuine feeling. But I can tell you this. No promise to your father could have forced me to care for you the way I do now." The way you care for us, Grace repeated bitterly, like a guardian cares for his charges, like a responsible man cares for his obligations, like a man cares for the woman he wants to marry, Clayton said sharply, his composure finally cracking. Like a man cares for the family he hopes to join, not just protect. How can I believe that? How can I know what's real when everything we've shared has been built on deception? Clayton stepped closer, his eyes intense with emotion. Because deception requires lies, and I've never lied to you. I may not have volunteered certain information, but every word I've spoken about my feelings has been true. Your feelings, Grace said, crossing her arms defensively. Tell me about your feelings, Mr. Rourke. When did duty become affection? When did obligation transform into something resembling love? The question seemed to hit Clayton like a physical blow. He turned away, running his hands through his hair in a gesture of frustration and vulnerability. I don't know, he admitted. Somewhere between watching you comfort Charity after a nightmare and seeing you stand up to Blackwood with that rifle. Somewhere between your sister's laughter at the dinner table and the way you looked at your mother's ring. I can't pinpoint the moment duty became something else, because it happened so gradually I didn't recognize it myself. Grace felt her resolve wavering, but forced herself to remember the evidence spread across the desk. Even if I believed you, it doesn't change the fact that our entire relationship has been built on false pretenses. Has it? Or has it been built on the foundation your father provided, because he knew something about my character that you're refusing to see? Before Grace could respond, Faith appeared in the doorway, her face pale with urgency. Grace, riders are coming. A lot of them. Clayton moved to the window immediately, his body tensing as he counted the approaching horses. 8 men. Armed. That's more than Blackwood brought last time. Grace joined him at the window, her personal conflict temporarily overshadowed by immediate danger. The riders moved with military precision, spreading out to surround the house rather than approaching directly. This isn't a negotiation, Clayton said grimly. This is intimidation designed to force a quick decision. Then they've misjudged us, Grace replied, moving toward the gun cabinet. But Clayton caught her arm. Grace, listen to me. I know you're angry about the letters, about feeling deceived, but right now none of that matters. What matters is keeping you and your sisters safe. We can handle. No, you can't. Not 8 armed men with instructions to acquire this property by whatever means necessary. Clayton's grip tightened with urgency. Swallow your pride for 5 minutes, and let me help you. Grace looked into his eyes and saw not the dutiful guardian she'd accused him of being, but a man genuinely frightened for their welfare. Whatever else might be true about his motivations, his concern for their safety was absolutely real. What do you suggest? Let me do the talking. Keep your sisters inside and away from windows. And Grace, his voice softened with something that sounded remarkably like love. Trust me. Just this once. Trust me. Before Grace could respond, Blackwood's voice carried across the yard. Miss Carver, we need to have a conversation. Clayton straightened, his expression hardening into the mask of authority Grace had glimpsed during his business dealings. Stay here, he told her, then walked onto the porch with the confident stride of a man accustomed to being obeyed. From the window, Grace watched the confrontation unfold. Blackwood had positioned his men strategically, 2 blocking the lane to town, 2 covering the back of the house, and 4 flanking him in a show of force designed to eliminate any thought of resistance. Blackwood, Clayton called out, his voice carrying easily across the distance. You're trespassing on private property. Just conducting business, Rourke. The ladies and I have unfinished negotiations. The ladies aren't interested in selling. Maybe they weren't last week, But circumstances change. Winter's coming, they're alone and vulnerable, and I'm authorized to make a final offer that's more than generous. Grace could see Clayton's tension in the set of his shoulders, the careful way he kept his hands visible but ready. What kind of final offer? $5,000 for the property, immediate possession, and safe passage to wherever they want to go. Or, Blackwood's voice took on a harder edge, they can stay and see what winter brings to folks who don't have proper protection. The threat was unmistakable, and Grace felt her sisters crowd behind her at the window, their fear palpable in the small space. "You're threatening women and children," Clayton said, his voice carrying dangerous quiet. "I'm offering a business solution to a problem that's going to get worse before it gets better. These ladies can't work this land alone, and you can't protect them indefinitely. Better to settle this peacefully while everyone can walk away with dignity intact." Grace watched Clayton's response with growing admiration despite her anger with him. He stood alone against 8 armed men, protecting a family he had no legal obligation to defend, facing down threats that could easily turn violent. From the kitchen came the sound of quiet movement. Hope gathering supplies, Faith collecting her medical kit, Charity moving to the back bedroom where she could watch for riders approaching from behind the house. Her sisters were preparing for a siege, trusting Grace to make the decisions that would keep them all alive. In the wrapped package Clayton had brought, Grace suddenly remembered, might be something that would change the situation entirely. As Blackwood's men shifted restlessly in their saddles, she made a decision that surprised herself. She was going to trust Clayton Rourke one more time. Grace unwrapped Clayton's package with trembling fingers, while the confrontation continued outside. Inside the brown paper, she found a folded piece of fabric that took her breath away, the beginning of a wedding quilt, pieced with intricate care in a pattern she recognized from her childhood. Her mother had started this quilt years ago, working on it during the long evenings when winter kept the family close to the fire. Grace remembered watching Sarah's needle flash in the lamplight, creating something beautiful from scraps of fabric saved from outgrown dresses and worn-out shirts. The pattern was wedding ring, interlocking circles that symbolized eternal love and unbreakable bonds. But how had Clayton come to possess it? Grace examined the careful stitching, noting where her mother's work ended and newer stitches began. Someone had been continuing Sarah's pattern, adding pieces with skillful hands and infinite patience. A folded note fell from within the quilt's folds. "Your father gave this to me 2 years ago, asking if I knew anyone who could finish it properly. I've been working on it myself, hoping someday to present it to the woman I wanted to marry. I thought you should have it now, regardless of your answer to my proposal." "See?" Grace's heart clenched as the implications sank in. Clayton hadn't just been fulfilling an obligation to her father, he'd been cherishing a dream of his own, one that involved joining their family in the most intimate way possible. Outside, the tension was escalating. Blackwood's patience was wearing thin, and his men were growing restless. "Time's up, Rourke," Blackwood called out. "Either the ladies accept our offer, or we'll have to pursue other options for acquiring this property." "What other options?" Clayton's voice carried a warning that made Grace's blood run cold. "Accidents happen to isolated homesteads. Buildings catch fire. People get lost in winter storms. Sometimes the only way to help folks is to make their situation so difficult they see reason." That was enough. Grace folded the quilt carefully, placed it in the kitchen where her sisters could see it, and picked up her father's rifle. Whatever Clayton's motivations might be, whatever hurt feelings existed between them, she wouldn't let him face 8 armed men alone. She stepped onto the porch, the Winchester held with competent familiarity. "Mr. Blackwood, you've made your offer and received your answer. This is private property, and you're no longer welcome here." Blackwood's attention shifted to her, his expression calculating. "Miss Carver, you're making this more difficult than it needs to be. We're offering you a chance to walk away from this with enough money to start over somewhere safe." "This is somewhere safe," Grace replied firmly. "This is our home, our land, and our choice. You have no right to threaten us or pressure us into selling." "Rights?" Blackwood laughed harshly. "Rights belong to people with the power to enforce them. 4 women alone don't have much power in this territory." "They're not alone." The voice came from the ridge behind the house, where Johnny Martinez appeared with a rifle in his hands and the confident posture of a man who knew how to use it. Within moments, more of Clayton's ranch hands emerged from strategic positions around the property, men who had clearly been watching and waiting for exactly this situation. Grace felt a surge of gratitude mixed with lingering confusion about Clayton's methods. He'd anticipated this confrontation and prepared for it, but he'd done so without consulting her or explaining his plans. "Looks like you're outnumbered, Blackwood," Clayton said, his voice carrying quiet satisfaction. "Might want to reconsider your approach." Blackwood's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "This isn't over, Rourke. You can't watch them every minute of every day. Maybe not, but I can make sure they're legally protected from further harassment." Clayton reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a folded document. "This is a complaint filed with the Territorial Marshal's office, detailing your threats and intimidation tactics. Any further aggressive action against this property or its residents will result in federal charges." Grace watched Blackwood's confidence crumble as he realized Clayton had outmaneuvered him completely. The land speculator had expected to find 4 defenseless women. Instead, he'd discovered a carefully planned defense orchestrated by a man with the resources and connections to make legal threats stick. "You think you're clever," Blackwood snarled. "But money talks louder than legal papers in this territory. We'll be back when you're not around to play protector." "I wouldn't recommend that course of action," Clayton replied calmly, "because I'll be around more than you might expect. You see, Miss Carver has just agreed to become my wife." Grace's heart stopped. She had agreed to no such thing, and Clayton knew it. But as she watched Blackwood's expression shift from anger to calculation, she understood the strategy behind the declaration. Marriage would give her the legal protection of Clayton's name and resources, making any further intimidation attempts significantly more dangerous for the perpetrators. The question was whether she was ready to accept that protection, knowing it came wrapped in obligations and uncertainties she still couldn't untangle. Grace felt all eyes turn to her, waiting for confirmation of Clayton's declaration. Blackwood's men shifted in their saddles, calculating how this new development would affect their plans. Clayton stood perfectly still, his back to her, having made a gamble that could either save them all or destroy any possibility of trust between them. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring until Grace made her choice. "That's correct," she said, her voice carrying across the yard with clear authority. "Mr. Rourke and I are engaged to be married." She saw Clayton's shoulders relax slightly, though he maintained his ready stance facing the potential threat. Behind her, she heard Faith's soft gasp of surprise, and Hope's quiet murmur of what might have been approval or concern. Blackwood's face darkened with frustrated rage. Convenient timing for this engagement, wouldn't you say? "Love doesn't follow a schedule," Grace replied evenly, "though I understand some men find that difficult to comprehend." The insult hit its mark, and Blackwood's hand moved instinctively toward his gun before Johnny Martinez's voice cut through the tension. "I wouldn't if I were you. We have you surrounded, and I've been wanting an excuse to test this new rifle." For a long moment, violence hung in the air like smoke. Then Blackwood slowly moved his hand away from his weapon, his eyes never leaving Grace's face. "This isn't finished," he said through gritted teeth. "Marriage or no marriage, this land will change hands. There are ways to deal with problems that legal papers can't prevent." "Are you threatening my fiancé?" Clayton's voice dropped to a dangerous quiet that made several of Blackwood's men exchange nervous glances. "I'm stating facts about how business gets done in this territory." Clayton took a step forward, and Grace saw something in his posture that made her understand why his ranch hands followed him without question, and why other cattle barons treated him with wary respect. "Let me state some facts of my own," Clayton said, his words carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "This woman and her sisters are under my protection. Any harm that comes to them, any harm at all, will be answered in kind. I have the resources to make that promise stick and the will to see it through. Do we understand each other?" Grace felt a chill at the controlled menace in Clayton's voice. This was the man who had built an empire in hostile territory, who had survived and thrived where weaker men had failed. This was the power he was offering to place at her disposal. Blackwood apparently recognized the same dangerous authority. "We understand each other perfectly, Rourke, but understand this. There are forces at work here bigger than your ranch operation. This valley is going to be developed whether you approve or not." "Then they'll develop it around us," Grace said, stepping beside Clayton to present a united front. "Because this family isn't going anywhere." Charity appeared at the door behind them, her young voice carrying surprising strength. "And if you come back here making threats, we'll be ready for you." Hope and Faith joined their youngest sister, standing together in a show of family solidarity that made Grace's heart swell with pride. Whatever doubts she had about Clayton's motivations, whatever complications existed in their relationship, her sisters were showing her that some things mattered more than wounded pride. "Mount up," Blackwood snarled to his men. "We're finished here for today." As the riders departed, moving with the sullen anger of men whose plans had been thwarted, Clayton's ranch hands maintained their positions until the threat had completely disappeared. Only then did Johnny approach the house, touching his hat respectfully to Grace. "Señorita, we will continue to watch the property until you feel secure. These men, they may try to return when they think you are not prepared." "Thank you, Johnny. All of you." Grace looked around at the faces of men who had risked their own safety to protect her family. "I don't know how to repay such kindness." "No repayment needed," Johnny replied with a smile. "Mr. Clayton, he is a good patron. When he says protect something, we protect it. When he says something is important, we make it important." After the ranch hands had dispersed to continue their watch, Grace found herself alone on the porch with Clayton. The immediate danger had passed, but the larger questions between them remained unresolved. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything you did today. For protecting us." Clayton turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "Does that mean you've forgiven me for the letters? For not telling you about your father's request?" Grace considered the question carefully. "It means I'm beginning to understand that some deceptions come from love rather than manipulation. And it means I've decided to trust you with something more precious than my pride." "What's that?" Grace met his eyes directly, seeing in them the same vulnerability she'd glimpsed the day he'd first handed her the deed to their land. "My heart," she said simply. "If you want it." The smile that spread across Clayton's face was worth every moment of uncertainty she'd endured. 6 months later, spring had painted the Carver homestead in shades of renewal and promise. Grace stood in the kitchen doorway, watching Clayton help Charity repair a section of garden fence, while Faith gathered herbs nearby and Hope supervised the construction of the new schoolhouse that would serve the growing community. The wedding had taken place in December, a simple ceremony in the parlor with their mother's wedding quilt draped over chairs to create a backdrop of love and continuity. Clayton had insisted on rewriting the property deed to include all 4 sisters as equal partners, ensuring that marriage enhanced rather than diminished their independence. "Mrs. Rourke," Faith called from the herb garden, using the new name that still made Grace smile. "Could you ask your husband if he's seen my pruning shears? I'm sure I left them by the mint patch." Grace found Clayton and Charity debating the merits of different fence post materials with the serious intensity that characterized all their collaborative projects. Marriage had brought Clayton fully into their family circle, but it had also revealed aspects of his character that pure courtship might never have shown. His patience with Charity's endless questions, his respect for Hope's intellectual pursuits, his genuine interest in Faith's healing work. "Clayton, Faith is looking for her pruning shears." "Ah." He produced the requested tools from his back pocket. "I borrowed them to trim that wild rose bush that was threatening to overtake the front gate. Didn't want anyone getting scratched." This consideration for small details exemplified the man Grace had married. Thoughtful, protective, but never controlling. He'd kept his promise that their union would be partnership rather than domination, consulting her on decisions while respecting her sister's continued presence in their shared home. "Grace!" Hope called from across the yard. "Come see what arrived with the morning post." Grace joined her sister at the new mailbox Clayton had installed, a practical addition that represented their growing integration into the broader community. Hope held a letter bearing official territorial seals. "It's addressed to all of us," Hope said excitedly. "From the Territorial Education Board." Grace opened the letter with curious hands, scanning the formal language until she found the crucial information. "They're offering you a position, Hope. Head teacher for the new consolidated school district, with authority to hire additional instructors and design the curriculum." Hope's face lit up with joy so bright it was almost painful to witness. "Really? They want me to run the whole program?" "With excellent salary and housing provided," Grace continued reading, "though I suppose housing isn't an issue since you can continue living here." "Actually," Hope said quietly, her expression growing thoughtful, "I've been considering moving to town, not because I don't love being here, but because I think it's time I built something of my own." Grace felt a familiar flutter of protective concern, but she recognized it now as love rather than control. Her sisters were growing into independent women with dreams that extended beyond the homestead's borders, exactly what their parents would have wanted. Clayton approached, having apparently finished his fence consultation with Charity. "Good news?" "Wonderful news," Grace replied, sharing Hope's achievement with the pride of a mother watching her child succeed. That evening, as had become their custom, the family gathered on the porch to watch the sunset, paint the mountains in gold and purple. Faith displayed her latest botanical sketches, while Charity regaled them with stories from her correspondence with other young women her age. Hope shared her plans for the school program, her eyes bright with purpose. Clayton had commissioned a family portrait from the traveling artist who'd passed through Bitter Creek the previous month. The finished painting now hung in their parlor, showing all 5 of them arranged naturally on this same porch, a visual testament to how completely he'd been integrated into their family structure. "I have something for all of you," Clayton said, producing a familiar wrapped package. Inside was the completed wedding quilt, finished according to Sarah Carver's original pattern, but expanded to include additional rings representing new family connections. "It's beautiful," Faith breathed, tracing the intricate stitching with reverent fingers. The new sections represent our blended family, Clayton explained. Your mother's original work honors your past, while the additions celebrate our future together. Grace examined the quilt with eyes that threatened to overflow with emotion. The wedding ring pattern had been extended to include 5 interlocking circles, instead of the traditional 2, one for each family member, connected in an unbreakable chain of love and commitment. "When did you find time to finish this?" she asked. Clayton looked slightly embarrassed. "Winter evenings when you thought I was reading cattle reports. Johnny's wife taught me the finer points of quilting. Apparently, I have adequate skills for someone who'd never held a needle before." Charity giggled at the image of their formidable husband bent over delicate needlework. "Can you teach me? I'd like to make something beautiful, too." "Of course," Clayton replied seriously. "Though I suspect your talents lie in different directions. I've seen your sketches. You have your mother's artistic eye." As twilight deepened into full darkness, the family gradually dispersed to evening routines. Grace and Clayton remained on the porch, sharing the comfortable silence of people who no longer needed words to communicate contentment. "Any regrets?" Clayton asked softly, taking her hand in his work-roughened fingers. Grace considered the question honestly. The past 6 months had brought challenges, adjusting to marriage, integrating 2 different approaches to life, learning to trust completely. But it had also brought joys she'd never imagined possible. "None," she said finally, "though I do have one confession." "What's that?" "I think I started falling in love with you the moment you handed me that deed. Not because of what you'd done, but because of who you revealed yourself to be in that moment." Clayton's smile was warm enough to chase away the evening chill. "Then we're well matched, because I started falling in love with you the moment you stood up to me with that rifle, defending your family's honor." Above them, the first stars appeared in a sky that promised clear weather for tomorrow's work. Grace leaned against her husband's shoulder, surrounded by the sounds of her sister's laughter drifting from inside the house, and knew that sometimes the greatest gifts came disguised as the greatest challenges. They had built something beautiful together, not just a marriage, but a family strengthened by adversity and enriched by love that had grown naturally from the seeds of duty into something infinitely more precious.